Bringing Elizabeth Home, Chapter 12. The Sunday after Elizabeth's kidnapping, Ed's sister Cynthia stood in front of the news cameras and said, "The person who has Elizabeth was confused. He cares for her and doesn't know what to do. The solution is to put your feelings aside and send Elizabeth back to where she feels the most, at home. Let her walk out to a public place where people recognize her." This request would later become a strange and frightening reality. Our family have been praying that the heart of Elizabeth's abductors would be softened. Every day during family prayer, each of us would individually pray for the safe return of Elizabeth. Our youngest son, William, wasn't able to pronounce the word abductor, so he prayed that the conductor would let Elizabeth go. His innocence was a breath of fresh air in this otherwise horrible situation. The search center had a plethora of volunteers that Sunday morning, who arrived in droves as the day went on. Later that night, 500 people gathered for a candlelight vigil to pray for Elizabeth as a community at Liberty Park. We drew some comfort from being with those people who came out to show their support of our family. Support was much needed as Ed had faced yet another set of his word earlier that day. Police had subjected him to an intense 4-hour lie detector test. Since we knew he had nothing to hide, he agreed to the test despite his already frazzled state of mind. It was 4 hours of torture, but the flickering candlelight during Elizabeth's vigil brought a sense of peace to us after a very long, hard day and week. As the sun set behind Liberty Park, Ed offered a prayer for Elizabeth. We could hear weeping coming from the gathered crowd. The love and support we felt was overwhelming. The Elizabeth Smart Search Center was originally set up at the Shriners Hospital, but the constant flood of volunteers turned out to be too much for the hospital. Arrangements were made to move the center across the street to the Federal Heights ward, where it would be held for about a month. Later, the center would move to Lois's brother's office, and then again to Ed's brother's David's home, where it would reside for the remainder of the search. Tom, like Ed, had also been considered a suspect, as were Ed's other brothers, Davis and Chris. Each of the brothers played a crucial role in the search. Tom's polygraph was inconclusive, but eventually he was cleared from suspicion, as were David and Chris. The Smart brothers were offended at being singled out as suspects. Yet, interestingly enough, the police never went to the horrible trouble of interviewing their wives to ask for alibis. They methodically questioned male members of both the Smart and Franklin families, but only the Smart brothers were subjected to polygraph tests. Were we beginning to feel resentful of the focus on extended Smart family? Yes, of course, absolutely. But as always, we would have done anything for Elizabeth. If this is what we had to endure to turn the focus on the real perpetrator, we were willing participants. The next possible break in the case was when police announced they had identified the driver of a strange car that had been seen cruising our neighborhood 2 days before Elizabeth was kidnapped. Charlie had been on our neighborhood milkman for quite some time, so he took note in the early morning hours of June 3rd when he saw an unfamiliar car driving slowly up and down our street. As he passed the car, Charlie waved to the driver in greeting and felt it was strange when the driver didn't reciprocate the gesture. The attitude and actions of the driver made Charlie nervous because other milkmen had been robbed in the area. As a precaution, he scribbled down the license plate information as best as he could make out. After hearing the news of Elizabeth's disappearance, Charlie called the police to report what he had witnessed 2 days before the abduction, either a Nissan or a Honda, with a driver who was short and wearing a white cap. The plate number he had recorded did not have much in the Utah database, but the police believed that the first 3 numbers were nonetheless correct. At the candlelight vigil for Elizabeth on Sunday night, police almost caught the mysterious driver by chance when people in the crowd complained about a man who was drinking beer and acting strangely. The police failed to reach the man across the crowd before he got away, but they discovered that he drove off in a green Ford Saturn with plates bearing the assumed correct 3 digits Charlie had provided. Days later, a little boy found the plate from this car discarded near a baseball field next to a major roadway about 15 miles from Salt Lake City. The plate number 266XJH had been provided stolen. With this evidence, police were able to identify this person as Brett Michael Edmonds. Edmonds had 2 outstanding warrants and a history of crime. He was wanted on a charge of fraud and for assaulting a police officer. Search dogs even traced his scent into one of the canyons where searches for Elizabeth had been taking place, but Edmonds didn't fit the description Mary Catherine had given of the man who took Elizabeth. The man she described seeing was 5 feet 8, 6 inches shorter than Edmonds. The following Tuesday, Chief Dents gave a press conference in which he expressed the feeling that the investigation was advancing, acknowledging that they did not yet have a clear suspect. He added, "We believe that it is possible that we have already talked to or will soon talk to the suspect that is responsible for this crime. They believe the kidnapper was still in the area." Dents addressed a warning directly to him. "We are going to get you, and if you got Elizabeth, you better release her now." When police released Edmonds' name to the public the next day, they cautioned that he wasn't a suspect, but they merely wanted to bring him in for questioning. By the time the news went public, Edmonds was leaving Utah. Lead after lead came in, and the search became a cross-country manhunt. As the search for Edmonds continued, the police had their eye on yet another suspect, Richard Reese. We went to sleep that night feeling like there had been some progress in the case. The next day, we woke to a horrifying headline in one of our local papers. The Salt Lake Tribune, police eye relatives, and probe. We were horrified and angered to discover that the police again believed the kidnapping had been an inside job. We have been through every test imaginable, and there was no evidence to support the salacious headline. The article pointed the finger at a member of our extended family. It was based on 4 unnamed sources, all of whom declined to be identified for the article. The article went on to make the claim that the window screen that had been sliced open in our kitchen had been cut from the inside, which suggested that someone had intentionally cut the screen to allow access to the home, misleading the investigation. The idea was to make the crime look like a break-in. It was later determined that Mitchell cut the screen and entered our home through the window, a window investigators believed was too narrow for a man to enter. Ed's brother Chris, who was an average-sized man, easily passed through the window when he attempted to prove to investigators that it was possible. The issue of the cut screen remained a point of contention throughout the investigation. We were certain of one thing: someone was purposely leaking information to create these firestorms. Was it the police? Was it an investigator? Why did the Tribune have the story when Deseret News didn't have any of the same information? Was a conspiracy brewing? The day the Tribune article ran, our frustration was deepening, and Ed's brother David spoke on behalf of the family. David said that we understood the police had a job to do. If they had not investigated the family, they would be remiss in doing their job. However, the time had come to shift that tide. It didn't matter that later in the day, Chief Dent said that the police were not eliminating anyone at that point. Mary Catherine should have been a key element in satisfying police that a family member was not responsible for Elizabeth's kidnapping. If she had recognized someone, she would have spoken up. She had been extremely forthcoming about the details she remembered from that night. We decided to issue a public statement challenging the Tribune article. It was highly speculative and was diverting the public focus and attention from the ultimate goal, finding Elizabeth. Lois' brother publicly assured that the family put no credence in the story. Shortly after Elizabeth disappeared, Mark Class showed up in the Salt Lake offering to help us in our fight. Mark had become a public advocate for missing children after his 12-year-old daughter, Polly, had been abducted from her bedroom and murdered in 1993. He tried to convey to us what we needed to do to move forward, to keep the story in the press. We have been grateful to meet him, knowing he would understand the pain we were in. We wanted to hear what he had been through so we could prepare ourselves and understand what to expect, knowing that the day might come when we had heard the news that Elizabeth was dead. We also understood that we would have to move past the moment because living for Elizabeth's kidnapping would not allow us or our family to have a life. Fox News also taped a short interview with us, though we hadn't originally thought of bringing in a sketch artist to work with Mary Catherine. Mark suggested that we place a call to Jeanne Bolin, a famed forensic sketch artist who had worked on several high-profile cases, including the Oklahoma City bombing. Best known is her hooded portrait of a Unabomber, which helped the FBI identify Ted Kaczynski. She had helped produce a sketch of Polly's kidnapper, and Mark felt she could be extremely helpful to us. He even offered to have Fox News pick up the cost. Unable to reach Bolin directly, we left a message on her machine to call us, but it would later become a controversy in the media that investigators initially chose not to use Bolin, and though we were very interested in having her involved, we decided to back the investigators' decision. The following week, Tom's daughters, Amanda and Sierra, appeared on the O'Reilly Factor, with Mark Class also a guest on the show. The Jeanne Boylan issue was raised as the as the first topic, and our choice to back the investigators was hotly debated. Tom especially was strongly criticized. O'Reilly questioned the girls about what they knew regarding the investigation. O'Reilly pushed hard, suggesting that it was strange for the girls to have nothing to add about the details, as the Smarts are a very close family. At the end of the show, the girls wound up leaving the studio in tears. Elizabeth's abduction remained on a topic on the O'Reilly factor for several days that week, as it was on many cable talk shows. Even though there was little information, it hurts deeply that a choice to follow the investigators' advice was so roundly criticized, in that we were being compared in some places to Susan Smith, who had killed her 2 young sons a few years earlier. And that is the end of chapter 12. I remembered Susan Smith's story, and that was so tragic when she made up a story that a man had abducted her kids and carjacked her, when really she drowned her own kids and locked them in a car and pushed the car in a river, and they were still alive, and her kids were 3 and the other one was like a couple months old. It was really sad. I felt bad for her ex-husband because she believed her story only to find out that her ex-wife killed the kids. It's awful. I know I'm going off topic. I guess I could read chapter 13. Why not? Let me see how long it is. Okay, yeah, I'll go to chapter 13. Alright, chapter 13. Brian David Mitchell. Oh, okay, we learned about Elizabeth's kidnapper. Brian David Mitchell had gotten away with kidnapping Elizabeth, but she was never convinced that God was in any way protecting him. It seemed as if he was getting away with everything, and he used this to try to rationalizing her captivity to her. He paraded her through downtown Salt Lake City without being recognized. She could hear people calling her name in the mountains, but no one ever found them. Would he have killed her if she didn't obey him? Fortunately, this is a question that will forever remain unanswered. Mitchell and Barzi tried to strip Elizabeth of everything, her identity, her family, her entire person, so that she would no longer be Elizabeth. They even started referring to her as Augustine. Mitchell certainly had a plan in which Elizabeth played a part, and he spoke to her often of how corrupt the world was and how he had been sent to save her from evil. She believed that he would kill her family if she tried to flee or was not cooperative. But she never accepted that he was a messenger of God. People ask us all the time why Elizabeth didn't try to escape, why she didn't try to break free. The answer is simple. She did try, and she couldn't get away. She was never left alone, and when the three walked up together, Brian and Wanda were on either side of her, holding her hands or otherwise making sure she couldn't run. When he started bringing her down to the canyon, she was forced to wear a robe and veil, which covered her entire face except her eyes. Her face had changed from constant exposure to the sun, wind, and rain. She had grown taller. No one seeing her on the street would have viewed her as a girl in distress, which in itself is remarkable. She went so deep into hiding for her own safety as well as for ours, she believed. She told us later that she could not live in fear, because to her, if she did, her worst fears would come to fruition. She chose to survive. She had no way of knowing whom she could trust. By trying to destroy everything she connected with her past life, Brian David Mitchell thought he could force his beliefs onto Elizabeth. Until she was, in a sense, pre-programmed, the only other person Elizabeth had contact in those 9 months was Wanda Barzi. Elizabeth was in public many times but never uttered a word. Brian always spoke for her. Many people have asked if Elizabeth suffered from Stockholm Syndrome, which is a phenomenon where victims begin to identify with their captors as they fear for their own lives. The personalities of Stockholm Syndrome victims do not really disappear and are pretty much the same after the ordeal as they were before. Elizabeth exhibited some of the traits of Stockholm Syndrome, but unlike most victims, she never bonded with her captors. She did what they said in order to survive. She was never fooled by their diabolical and distorted views. Elizabeth was not the same person physically when she came home, but our daughter still very much existed as we remembered her. We believe she did what she had to do to survive. In Elizabeth's mind, she chose life over death, life over herself. She was forced to live a life that wasn't her own. She didn't believe anything her captors said except for the threats of killing her and us. She knew she didn't want to die. She had no way of knowing if there was other people involved. In her mind, Brian had followers watching the house, following our every move. She was led to believe that if she slipped up, we would be harmed. She had to live with that threat every day she was gone. Elizabeth never left the campsite, her prison, until early August after her return. No. After her return, people remember seeing a strangely dressed man and a woman with a young girl shrouded in white robes all over Salt Lake. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee had gotten so brazen and confident they would never be found that they started parading Elizabeth throughout the streets of her hometown. To be sure, there must have been some fear that they'd been caught, since Mitchell insisted she cover her face, leaving only slits for her eyes. They had come in plain sight, but who would have known it was Elizabeth? The outfit of white robes was mysterious, but not strange enough to prompt anyone to question it. We can only guess that people thought that Elizabeth and her captors were part of a religious group. The hunt for Brett and Michael Edmonds ended on June 21st when Edmonds checked himself into a hospital in West Virginia for an apparent drug overdose. He had given a false name when he registered at the hospital, but he had used his mother's real phone number as his emergency contact. He was in critical condition, so as hospital workers contacted his family in Utah, a relative called the sheriff's office, igniting a sequence of phone calls between police in Utah and the hospital in West Virginia to confirm that the patient was Edmonds. When the police was certain they had their man, investigators flew to West Virginia to question him. They were able to recover his car, tow it from the hospital, and arrange for a warrant to search it. We were unaware of Edmonds' arrest until later that day. The news was encouraging, but we didn't want to get our hopes up too high, since Elizabeth had yet to be found. We prayed that Edmonds would cooperate and reveal any information he had about our daughter. The following day, we were hit with our hardest knock on the media to date. Make that the tabloid media. The National Enquirer came out with a story that sent a crushing jolt through our entire family. At the same time, we declined to acknowledge this scandalous report, and we still feel strongly about not commenting. All the legitimate media covering our story refused to give credits to the story. Many stores in Utah showed their support for our family by pulling the Enquirer from its shelves. It was an extremely cruel report that we chose to deal with only after Elizabeth had been returned safely. 5 weeks after Elizabeth came home, the National Enquirer issued a retraction of its story, admitting it was false and settling an out-of-court agreement with our family. What became troublesome to us was not just the articles that were being written, but the continuous leaks that seemed to flow from Salt Lake, the police department, to the media, especially to two reporters working for the Salt Lake Tribune. Information was being provided by unnamed sources and law enforcement, and stories were emerging that were filled with accusations, finger-pointing, and bald-faced lies. Further, their indiscretion in selling that information to tabloid newspapers proved to be very damaging to the investigation. There was evidently a need to make news about our family when the story was about our missing child. Why couldn't the focus of the case stay on bringing Elizabeth home? We could take up several pages in this book lambasting on the lack of journalistic integrity of those two Tribune reporters, but we have decided as a family that has endured heartful and painful lashing in the press, not to put those reporters through what we have been through. These two men have families, wives, children, and relatives, all innocent people who would have been negatively impacted by choices those two reporters made throughout the investigation. Enough said. On the night of July 24th, a strange and familiar terror would hit another member of our family. A niece was asleep in bed when she awoke to a sound of picture frames crashing from her windowsill onto the floor. It was a hot summer night, and she had gone to bed with her window open. Her family had installed a stop on the window so it could be open only a few inches. It was open when she went to sleep. She woke to see an arm poking through the screen. She thought she saw a gun and sat up in bed, watching in horror as the arm pulled back and disappeared. Her father, Lois, his brother-in-law, heard the loud noise and was startled out of bed. He rushed to a room where he was met by his frantic daughter. He searched the house and found a chair outside the window, propped up against the wall in exactly the same way as was the one that was found outside our home the night Elizabeth was taken. He called the police, who arrived within minutes. Police looked at the window and saw cuts in the screen just like the ones at our home, vertically and horizontal. The police dusted for fingerprints but came up with no solid leads. The police didn't put very much emphasis on the striking similarities of the two break-ins. They stayed at the house for a while, but turned up nothing unusual, and after an intense 2-week investigation by the FBI, they concluded that the incident was probably a prank by the teenage boys. We were not as certain as the police that there was no connection to Elizabeth's kidnapping. It was only after Elizabeth came home that we discovered that Brian David Mitchell had planned to kidnap one of Elizabeth's cousins. He had a list of girls he wanted to kidnap to complete his plan of having 7 wives. Brian's mother lives in an adjoining neighborhood as our niece's family. When Brian told Elizabeth that he was familiar with that area, Elizabeth mentioned that she had a favorite cousin who lived there. Elizabeth had no way of knowing that Brian was plotting another kidnapping. In the end, Elizabeth hoped and prayed that their dog would be out and scare him away. The twist to this story is that when the break-in happened, the man police had all but pinned Elizabeth's kidnapping on, Richard Reese, was sitting in a jail cell. This led to us to believe that Richard Reese may have had an accomplice. Was this a copycat crime, a cruel prank, or was there someone else out there who had kidnapped Elizabeth and was looking to strike again? The news of the second break-in didn't go public until August 9th. It supported our belief that perhaps Reese hadn't acted alone and that the hunt for Elizabeth had to continue. There had to be someone else who had our daughter, which confirmed our belief that there was a good chance that she was still alive. Crucial time was passing, and all eyes were on innocent men. We appreciated everything the police were doing. We supported their efforts 100%. But we knew, as parents of a missing child, that no matter how much is being done to bring your child home, it never feels like enough. Every day without answers was torturous. In the weeks that followed, we continued to make public pleas to whoever had Elizabeth. We tried to keep the public informed whenever there was news, but we were no longer giving our daily news briefings to the media. Releasing pertinent information was a crucial part of our plan to save Elizabeth. Although the break-in at our relative's home certainly indicated the possibility of another person being involved, the police felt they had the right man in custody, Richard Reese. It was hard to ignore the evidence against Reese, so hard that we couldn't help but begin to believe he was responsible for bringing this terror into our lives. We released a public statement once again asking for someone to please step forward with information about Elizabeth. The statement says, to the holders of Elizabeth Ann Smart and her friends throughout the world, it has been several weeks since our daughter Elizabeth was awakened during the night and taken from her home by force. Every minute of the day, we continue to search for her, pray for her, and yearn for her to come home. So many of you have joined us in our search and prayers. Since we last saw Elizabeth on the evening of June 4th, we have not received any communication from the person who took her. We continue to eagerly await information about her location. We believe that through awareness of this terrible tragedy in our family, many children throughout the world will be saved. As the authorities continue to piece together a puzzle, we still are only interested in one thing: finding Elizabeth. We believe that she is still alive and wants desperately to be returned to us. Whether or not you are the person who took her, we are pleading with you to do the right thing and let her come home. Anxiously waiting, Ed and Lois Smart. After Brett and Michael Edmonds was clear of any involvement in Elizabeth's kidnapping, all of us focused on Richard Reese as the primary suspect. When they brought him in for questioning, Reese, faced with proof, finally admitted stealing Lois's bracelet and to breaking into our neighbor's home, but emphatically denied any connection to the kidnapping. The police had checked pawn shops and found one that had a receipt with a detailed description of the bracelet. This allowed them to put a heated pressure to confess to abducting Elizabeth. By admitting his guilt in stealing the bracelet, Reese had proved to us once again that he was not a man of integrity. He had lied to our faces, and he was convincing. The evidence was mounting against Reese, and investigators seemed to be building a good circumstantial case. Though the police brought him in to be interviewed about the kidnapping, there was no evidence concrete enough to warrant holding him. Several people were called and questioned by the grand jury investigating Reese, including his wife, Angela, and he steadfastly testified that Reese was home in bed with her on the night of Elizabeth's abduction. She had given statements to the media on the morning of the kidnapping, expecting that her husband would be fingered. The police administered a polygraph test to Reese about the kidnapping, which he passed. But he had lied so many times to us. How could we believe him about anything, especially after the disappearance of our daughter? The biggest hole in the Reese story revolves around the Jeep we gave him. We were told that on May 30th, Reese picked up his Jeep from Ness Auto Repair. He returned the Jeep on the morning of June 8th. According to Neth Mao, there were approximately 500 to 1,000 new miles on the odometer since he had picked it up. Reese was so usually very friendly, was uncharacteristically reserved. He loaded some things from the Jeep into 2 bags and also took a postal digger. When he left, he met up with a friend across the street and then disappeared. In the wake of Elizabeth's disappearance, all of this raised several questions in the investigator's mind about where Reese was and what he was doing. It appeared extremely suspicious. Mao said that on May 30th, 2002, he received a phone call from a woman claiming to be Reese's wife, asking about the Jeep. The story given was that they needed the Jeep to get to work. Neth told them to come and get the car. The Jeep had been ours for 2 years, and Elizabeth had written in it numerous times, so any evidence of her found inside would not be enough to implicate Reese in her kidnapping. Reese denied he had taken the Jeep and refused to answer investigators' questions about the added miles. He's had several chances to vindicate himself with regard to the kidnapping, but he refused to say where he was, whom he was with, or what he had been doing. What was he hiding, if anything? Salt Lake City District Attorney David Yoakum filed felony charges against Reese for theft of money, jewelry, and other items he confessed to taking from our home and our neighbors. In an effort to build a stronger case against Reese, Yoakum also charged him with habitual criminal charges, which, if convicted, would put him in jail for the rest of his life. Reese was taken into custody, and Salt Lake City police hoped to garner a confession about Elizabeth. They had established that Reese had a pattern of breaking into occupied homes in the middle of the night. We desperately sought answers we believed Reese could provide. He wanted Reese to give us a reasonable explanation for the miles. Neth Mao said he put on the Jeep. If Reese wasn't involved in the kidnapping, precious time was slipping away while the investigation was focused on him. The evidence, even if it was circumstantial, was very convincing. It certainly appeared to everyone involved that Reese was somehow connected. We wanted truthful answers, and in seeking those, we offered a reward for any information regarding Reese's whereabouts between May 30th and June 8th, 2002. We also offered a reward to anyone who could identify the man waiting for Reese the night Reese returned the Jeep to Neth Mao's garage. No one ever stepped forward with a single concrete lead in either investigation. Reese never offered a reasonable explanation about his whereabouts. In early July 2001, Richard Reese took part in a bank robbery in Sandy, Utah, getting away with slightly more than $1,700. Reese was indicted for armed robbery on July 17, 2002. One of the other men involved confessed to the bank robbery, implicating Reese. This came on the heels of the charges brought against Reese for the robbery of our home and our neighbor's home. Our understanding was that Reese was imprisoned and held in a maximum security facility. Police had hoped that leaving him in a solitary confinement would prompt a confession about Elizabeth, but Reese never admitted to any involvement. At the roll call hearing in July, Ed pleaded with Reese's wife, Angela, for the truth. Angela expressed her sincere grief over Elizabeth's disappearance. Ed asked Angela to talk to Reese to see if there was anything he could tell us to help find Elizabeth. He took her by the hand and said, "We have got to find our daughter." We pleaded with her. Angela insisted that Reese was not involved in the kidnapping, but promised to talk to her husband anyway. But did he take Elizabeth? The Richard Reese saga was one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation. The media was obsessed with what we thought about Reese's case. We didn't want to comment when we went to the courthouse for the pretrial hearing. There were so many reporters that there was literally no room for us to sit in the courtroom. We were a bit surprised. Someone from the court finally came out and said that only one of us could go inside. We felt it was best for Ed to go, but we were later told that we could both attend the hearing. We had no idea it would be such a big deal. This was just a pretrial hearing. If this was the coverage for the theft charges, we could only imagine the media circus that would follow for our kidnapping trial. We wanted to sit on the trial to hear Reese tell his story. In his own words, maybe we were looking for a sign that he knew where Elizabeth was, or perhaps we wanted to stare him in the eyes and tried to get a read on his alleged innocence. We were seeking the truth regardless of how upsetting it could have been. There was a motion for a continuance for Reese's lawyer, who wanted an opportunity to further discover what in the world they were looking for. He admitted to taking Lois's jewelry. He stole from us. That was a fact. After the first day of the hearing, microphones were shoved in our faces by reporters who wanted to know how we felt. We thought, what we felt and what we thought. If we were satisfied with the outcome, and if we were satisfied with the outcome. Our publicist, Chris Thomas, scurried us through the crowd and told us not to talk to anyone. We were getting used to the crowds, but we never seemed to get comfortable with the attention. While the investigation into Richard Reese was still ongoing, we received an email from an anonymous person who claimed to have seen Reese working on a fence in Wyoming. Somehow, that email got erased. We were just sick over losing that correspondence. We eventually made a public plea to whoever sent the email to resend the information. We never heard from that person again. We find it hard to believe that any one person can be alone in the world. Someone, somewhere, knew who sent us that email, or just as someone knew whom Richard Reese met the night he returned the Jeep to Neff Miles' garage. A friend, a neighbor, a family member, someone knew. The Jeep remains a mystery. There was a rumor that someone in Cedar City was able to vindicate Reese, but we have yet to hear a confirmation of that. Reese's attorney is bound by client-lawyer privilege, so he cannot reveal Reese's whereabouts the night Elizabeth was taken. We never understood why Reese wouldn't clear his name with respect to the kidnapping allegation. What could be worse than that? And the unthinkable happened. We received a phone call from Corey Lyman, the lead investigator of Elizabeth's case at the time. He informed us that Richard Reese has suffered an aneurysm in his prison cell, and it looked as if he would not make it. Reese never regained consciousness, and he died on August 30th, 2002. The police had placed so much emphasis on Reese, there was no faulting their efforts to prove his guilt. They had gone to southern Utah to interview some of the cohorts. They re-interviewed his wife. They did a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it would be all for naught. School was starting, and it was time to resume family life. It was time we faced that Elizabeth might actually be dead. As hard as it was to bear, the thought was becoming difficult to dismiss. We faced that possibility with very different perspectives. That's the end of chapter 13. God, that's awful. Oh, I can't imagine having a child being taken from me for that long. I'm going to stop the video there.